Well, I decided I'm going to go ahead and make this into a two-part thing because I went up to proof this last video that's going to end up being video number 1 of 2 about sizing and clicking and cases and why they stick and why they don't and how they hang up and how they don't hang up. And I went on, I previewed these after I play them. I go run them on my little laptop, and I decided to go check a shooting forum. And there's some guy on there that stuck a case in his die. And he throws it out, and again we have this endless bunch of goobers opining on why cases stick in dies. And the funny thing is, an awful lot of it revolves around case lube. And you get people that really think they know what they're talking about. They're saying things like, well, if you don't know how to use imperial sizing die, then you're just not even sizing. You might as well pick a booger out of your nose and size with that, as if you're not using, or quit using that RCBS water-soluble stuff, because it's... And people go on and on and on about sizing die lubrication, when in simple fact, you could pick a booger out of your nose and it would work just fine if your stuff works. I've sized cases for match shooting using Butch's Borsheim that I'm happen to be cleaning with, and using it to clean my necks and as lube in the die. Keeps the die clean. I've used and own all the different... You'll see guys, well, if you quit using that Hornady one-shot, that Hornady will get you in trouble every time because it's a bunch of... No, people. When you're getting cases stuck in the die, it comes full circle back to what I was talking about in the prior video. In the prior video, I mentioned as how we have to understand that these mechanisms are tied together. There's a reason for they all lead into each other. They're not a whole bunch of disparate, separate things. In the same way that I don't believe in drug addiction, I believe in attacking the root. To me, drug usage or drinking or any of these problems people have are signs of an addictive personality. They're symptoms in many, many, many cases. When it comes to reloading practices, different symptoms are manifestations of the same set of problems. And this is kind of why I decided to add to this video, to let you know that I've used the term before, nothing exists in a vacuum, and that's completely true. And what that means in its simplest terms is that in most cases, action is followed by reaction, or in most cases, there are multiple expressions of what's going on. And I'm going to just spend a minute here. This, again, might get disjointed. I've done videos in the past on how cases work and how cases grow and how cases this and how cases that. But again, I'm going to draw a cartridge case here, and I'm going to try to illustrate a few things yet again about how these mechanisms work. This is going to turn into another of my, and I've done so many of them now that people are getting bored with them, my Think People videos. Think with me. Think, think, think. Because in the end, we must think our way out of these situations and problems for them ever to resolve themselves. And this time I've drawn a cartridge case with some of the items that we're going to talk about accentuated. In the last video I drew this case head, and maybe I didn't draw it as thickly as I should have. just understand that this section of the case head right here cannot be resized. All of the resizing, all of the work is done from here up. The whole length of the body of the case, the shoulder section, and the neck section, all of the sizing and all of the work is taken care of and is done up here. This section right here, and I don't have, I'm going to drag some cases over here in case any of these illustrate the bulged section. Okay, there we go. I'm going to hold this just like this. This is a big 338 Lapua case, custom designed to take enormous amounts of pressure. One of the things that they did, and you can see it right there in the picture, they've got this area almost as thick as I drew it right here. That area right there at the base of this case, see that area that's not bulged out? See this area down here that is got a ring? It's important to know this is the slug, this is the base, this is the area of the case that cannot be resized, will never be resized. This case is called the 338 McCallum. This particular one has got, if I roll it around, you're going to be able to see there's sizing rings on it. This case has probably been fired 30 or 40 times. These last forever. I start by turning a brand new case. This one's never been molested and it never even been fired. Never. I was hoping I could get it into the camera in such a way that I might need to move this up a little bit so that you can see that I turn. This thing starts out, I feather my turning way up into the neck. That's just something that happens to show up good on this. I do this on PPCs, I do this on everything. Every one of these cases in here is turned, those being over on this side, and they're turned way up into the neck portion. But the things that we can learn from this case are fascinating and they're good. Just remember that this section down here, no small base die, no ring die, no deep die, no long die, no custom die of any sort will ever size this area down here. All that can happen down in here, and believe me, this is a long ways up on the case. As I'm holding this, you can see that this is a very, very thick portion on this particular case. This area was built thick, was built meaty to withstand tremendous pressure before case failure. Case failure in the case of a cartridge always has to do with deformation of this portion of the head. In some cases, it extrudes a plug or pushes into, let's say, the ejector or the extractor. Some will go into the extractor cut, some will go into the ejector hole. The next thing that happens is that this case head begins to enlarge. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it starts to leak around the primer, and also the primer becomes loose and falls out. All of these things are tied together, and this case was specifically designed, not made, it was designed from the ground up to take tremendous pressure, and part of that design has to do with the fact that this section here of solid billet case head is deep and huge and stout, and it will take a ton of pressure before the case is destroyed. Now in between there we got a bunch of other problems like cases clicking when you use them. Clicking means that somewhere right in here where the case brass fades from thin to thick, as you continue to hammer this, because remember the chamber must have a certain amount of clearance in it, and these marks on this case are specifically shaped just like that. This portion here does not move. It's consequently small. Somewhere in here, we start to get into thin enough brass that it yields and pops out, and that right there is that ring right there on the case. This is a drawing of what this looks like. Might not be a very good drawing. You can pick on me all you want. I don't care. Because, and I did, by the way, I was wondering what's wrong with this. There, that's more like it. Primer pocket, flash hole. Primer pocket doesn't go all the way through the case head. So, ignore these here. We're crossing these out. This big, heavy-duty hunk of brass right here withstands a tremendous amount of pressure. Now, if my chamber is sized in such a way that this portion of the body right here is only a tiny bit bigger than this portion of the base right here, which is very common. Match grade reamers are many times built in such a way that the entire chamber dimension, the radial chamber dimension, is only 2 or 3 thousandths larger than the base of the case. What that means is, as the base of this case starts to expand, which it always does to a point, and furthermore, as this sizing area right here creeps its way down, you can get down to where even this pretty thick brass is starting to, you know, with repeated pressure hammerings, this down here hasn't budged yet, but this ring right here, which is stopped right there, will creep its way incrementally down as it bends out or folds out or somehow manages to tilt or bend. And this is why small base dies, ring dies, over-length dies, shortened shell holders all work, because they allow the die to come down enough further that they resize this little tiny ring area right here. Now, you're never going to see a ring die or a small base die for the 338 Lapo, because the whole thing is designed. Most dies are already sizing clear down into this area here on a cartridge case. I have this cartridge case right here, and you can notice on this side we can't see the bulge that we show on this one. So unfortunately we can't show it to you, but trust me, the difference between this heavy, thick, meaty portion and the amount that's shown out here is very small. Whereas this has got a big, that's all solid copper, solid brass case head on this big 338. It's very thick. It's a 1/4 of an inch thick. On this little BR case, it's only a 1/16 of an inch thick. So that means that to size down into this area and get that last little roll, if you're clicking, if this case, this would be is this a PPC or a BR? I'm going to say this is a BR case. It looks like it. It's very similar to the PPC case. But the PPC case is another one that has a very tiny, minuscule ring left down here to size with. So you can grind out a shell holder, you can knock the chamfer off, you can get an extended die. All you're doing though, these are all fixes for a problem that should have never happened. Had this BR case or PPC chamber or whatever been large enough, had the chamber been made large enough, the sizing equipment that you already own will come down and address this area right here, and you will never have a click. This particular case is wildly oversized because I designed it that way. I designed this in such a way that this portion of the case is much larger than the base. By the time this base section, that darkened section there, that thick section there, get it back in the light so that you can see it the way it really looks. By the time this section ever swells up to where it could be hanging up in any way, the primer is going to be laying on the floor. The primer is going to be laying on the ground. And I just want you to understand, here's another one. This is a case that's been fired many, many, many times. Again, we're seeing that. Whether you're sticking the case in your chamber and sizing your way back out of it to try to get rid of the click, or whether you're worse than that, sticking a case in the die, it's never a function of lube. It fries me to see these silly people on the inner tube getting in arguments about lubrication. In simple fact, you can't lube your way out of this conundrum. When you're trying to size the case head, and your die is so skinny, and your chamber is so skinny, and your brass is so fat that we're developing a conflict to where the die is coming down onto this unresizable section, and the chamber of the gun is tight enough to hang up on that unresizable section. That is the root of the problem. And every die that's ever been stuck, every cartridge case that's ever been stuck inside of a die, every single instance of where somebody has spent days soaking in Croil and sticking in the freezer and beating out and pulling from the back and boring and ding, are always caused not by lube. Forget the lube. There's no lube in the world that's going to make a difference. Well, sometimes you can change lubes, and even though that you're squeaking down onto this portion of the die and jamming your way down and coming back off, there are lubes that will hold up well enough that even though this isn't sizing, you can get the die on and off of the cartridge case, or you can get the cartridge case in and out of the die. They're just two different ways of saying the same thing. But in every case, the problem is the mismatch between the size of your case and the size of your resizing equipment, coupled with the size of your chamber. Those three items must match. The chamber must be big enough that it can never hang up on this unsizable brass. Ring dies, small base dies, and the other fixes don't actually approach the problem. They only come down far enough to deal with this little section. In other words, they're not resizing the base of the case. They're resizing the case wall adequately, and down here where it's starting to get thick and it's harder to size because maybe the case wall is 15 thousandths thick brass and it acts the way it's supposed to, you get down into this 20, 30, 40 thousandths thick brass, it's still popping out. It's still, as I face the camera, as the case walls pop out, it'll still fold or bend or work. Those areas, if I can get this case turned to where you can see it, you'll see that that is still a roll coming up out of there. And the brass down here at the base of this roll is definitely quite a bit thicker, because remember, the interior brass is fading into the exterior brass, and we are going from all the way through the case thick, we're rolling up into super thin, and at this transition point right here, there are a whole series of dies made to come down and only work with that little section right there and get that to roll back in until your gun quits clicking. A couple of things happen. Number one, you tend to stick dies that way. You tend to stick cases into dies and not get them back out, tear the case head right off. Just remember this. As I said in segment number 1, when I started, the name of this whole scenario, my whole YouTube channel, is called Opinions by Al. These are not opinions. This episode and the episode prior to this are not opinions by Al. These are simple facts that I'm explaining to you, that as long as your chambers are small and your dies are small, such that they'll hang up on the base of your brass cases do grow. Period. Now, these, as you can tell when I roll them around in the light, if I can get them right, you can see that the base section hasn't grown diametrically very much. As this tends to grow, the primer pockets will loosen, and this dimensional difference between the base and the walls will decrease. It will shrink. This will grow out to more closely match this, but never on this particular case, never on this setup will it ever hang up in here, because I've been careful to size it in such a way that it can't. And never, even if I pick boogers out of my nose and use that, or sweat from my armpits, or rub the thing in my hair for case lube. In other words, if I cheat the case lube, I will still never stick this case in the die. I don't live in fear of it. I don't have to worry about it. It's not a thing. But it's because of sizing. It's not because of lubrication. That's the key that I'm trying to make in this whole thing here. Understand the mechanism, people. Think, think, think. Ask, ask, ask. But asking good questions of the right people and getting good answers is a really big deal in this world. And that's why I decided to start this channel in the first place, was to put out some information that's real and that's repeatable and that will never, ever, ever get you in trouble. It's like, I'm going to reference one more time my idea of testing cases to destruction, because that ties into this whole thing. I recently designed the 338 Hellbringer case, a huge case to compete with this. And I ran it through its paces all the way up until I tested the case to destruction, which means that I ran the pressures up incrementally until the case had expanded, which diametric expansion caused the primers to loosen, until the primers got loose, and at that point that case is destroyed. That is the scientific way, the logical way, the think with me people way to bring a case up and find its limits. Test it to destruction. And in finding the limits, we can find that all these things are tied together. There are no disparate mysteries out there. There are no weirdnesses. And remember, it's very rarely is it about something as simple as case lube. No, this is a fitment thing. Let's get our fitments right.